The battle to free the Iraqi city of Mosul intensifies as thousands of civilians flee the fighting. More than 1 million people are in the city, among them up to 6,000 Islamic State militants. Our correspondent says they're putting up a fight.
They spotted a number of suicide truck bombs coming towards them. We think two of them at least went off. Not sure about the third. It looks like everybody managed to escape. It was a close shave.
The city was captured by so-called Islamic State 2 years ago. It's now their last stronghold in Iraq. Also this lunchtime. Children continue to arrive in the UK from Calais' migrant camp as the Home Office says more rigorous age checks will be carried out. A murder inquiry is launched after a prisoner is stabbed to death in North London and 2 other inmates are injured. The search for life on Mars. The European Space Agency hopes to land a small robot on the red planet for the first time today. And discovered off Scotland's west coast, the first images of a German U-boat sunk almost a century ago.
Here, a charity offering rooms for so-called bed blockers says it's had no NHS patients since it opened. And Terry Waite back in Wiltshire, a return to RAF Lynham 25 years after his release.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Thousands of people are trying to flee Iraq's second biggest city, Mosul, as the battle to free it from so-called Islamic State continues. Mosul is the last stronghold in Iraq of Islamic State jihadists. Iraqi and Kurdish forces with British and American assistance are into the 3rd day of a military operation to retake the city. Around 1,000 civilians have managed to escape the city and make it across the border to Syria. Many more are expected to follow. Our correspondent Andy Moore reports.
Iraqi tanks on the move today, continuing their advance towards Mosul. The coalition forces say they are progressing well. A combined force of some 30,000 troops is advancing against what's thought to be about 5,000 Islamic State fighters. The fighting is fierce and at close quarters. These pictures have just emerged of Kurdish Peshmerga forces making their way building by building towards the outskirts of the city. In such a confusing battlefield, coordination between the Iraqi and the Kurdish forces is essential. And a BBC film crew embedded with the Iraqi army witnessed at first hand the dangers facing the advancing troops. The general in charge shouted urgent orders as the convoy came under attack from IS suicide bombers driving trucks.
Well, that mad rush across the desert happened after we've skirting a village and they spotted a number of suicide truck bombs coming towards them. We think 2 of them at least went off. Not sure about the third. It looks like everybody managed to escape. It was a close shave.
These images are from so-called Islamic State. IS is keen to show that its fighters are putting up a fierce resistance to the approaching troops. IS has also released this video, which is said to show the results of a coalition air raid against a health centre on the outskirts of the city. The BBC has no way of verifying these images, but the aid agencies are worried that military operations in a city of 1 million people will inevitably cause civilian casualties. As the military forces liberate the villages around Mosul, the first civilians are emerging from their homes under cover of a white flag. The aid agencies say thousands of refugees are currently on the move. They fear that might become tens of thousands and present them with a huge humanitarian crisis.
We are expecting a lot of people to come out. People are scared, people are afraid. They don't know what's happening, but they're hearing loud explosions and they're hearing the fighting coming closer. So we have around 500,000 children, estimated number of 500,000 children in Mosul city, and they're all scared and terrified.
This is a refugee camp being set up on the outskirts of Mosul. It will house around 5,000 families. If the worst predictions about the number of refugees come true, many more camps like this will be needed. Andy Moore, BBC News.
The Home Office says more rigorous age checks will be carried out on children arriving in the UK from the migrant camp in Calais. Concerns have been raised that some of the first group who came yesterday were not under 18. 12 more are heading to the UK today. They're from Syria, Pakistan and Afghanistan. Our correspondent Simon Jones sent this report from Calais.
Another 12 identified as vulnerable children from Syria, Afghanistan and Pakistan left Calais this morning for a new life across the Channel. One of them is 13-year-old Shamshay. The BBC has been following his journey after Lily Allen interviewed him last week.
I want to go to school in London, to join my brothers to start a new life there.
Pictures of the first arrivals on Monday as part of a scheme to get children out of the so-called jungle camp before its destruction have led some to question whether they really are children. The French authorities admit checks on their age are limited.
You don't have a medical check to be sure of their age. It's with interview. After in Great Britain, maybe there are other checks for that, but not in France.
One Conservative MP has called for tests on the teeth of the new arrivals to establish their age.
There is a test that will determine people's age with a fair degree of accuracy, and I think where there are doubts, then we ought to be willing to ask people to undergo a quick dental check or a wrist x-ray.
But it's been suggested that one of the children pictured was actually an interpreter, not part of the group, and critics say mandatory medical checks are inhumane and won't work.
It isn't a magic bullet, it's a very complex situation, we all age differently, and the suggestion that this is a very simple, cheap solution is just wrong. Also, it is unethical to be exposing individuals to radiation. It's a medical procedure, and to do it for something that really has such a poor evidence base really cannot be supported.
Amid concerns about how vulnerable children are being identified here in the jungle, the Home Office says it will now carry out additional checks on those arriving in the UK. They could be fingerprint checks to try to verify those against other documents showing the children's age, and there could now be additional interviews with the relatives back there. On both sides of the Channel, officials know maintaining public confidence is vital. Simon Jones, BBC News, Calais.
Police have begun a murder inquiry after a prisoner was stabbed to death at Pentonville Jail in North London. 2 other inmates were critically wounded. 2 more were arrested. The Prison Governors Association has blamed public sector cuts for increasing violence in prisons and is calling for a public inquiry. Our correspondent Sarah Campbell is at the prison for us now. Sarah.
Well, Sophie, little detail is known about the exact events of yesterday afternoon, other than we understand it happened in a prison wing with the other prisoners moved into the yard. But as you say, what we do know is that it left 1 man dead and another 2 critically injured. Pentonville Prison was already at the centre of concerns over levels of violence and drug use, and prison governors have said today that at least some of the blame for what's happened should lie with government cuts. They say that it's left prison conditions squalid and brutal.
A Victorian jail, which many of those working inside say is no longer fit for purpose. More than 1,200 men are imprisoned here, and violence is, according to staff, a common occurrence.
I was duty governor there a few months ago, over the weekend. We had prisoners fighting, we retrieved weapons from them. We had drugs coming over the wall that were packed into tools so that they could get through the netting. We had a prisoner that was protesting at height because he was too scared to go back onto his wing. I saw 3 prison officers unlock a prisoner for a mandatory drug test, and the abuse these officers received was something I'd never seen before.
Lawlessness, both inside and outside the prison, is adding to problems. Contraband, which could include drugs or weapons, is finding its way in, as this footage filmed outside the prison walls clearly shows. Neighbours have long been filming and complaining about what's being passed through holes in the netting and even via drones. The increase in drugs within the prison walls, especially so-called legal highs such as spice, has been highlighted as a reason behind levels of violence and self-harm. So far this year, across England and Wales, there have been 3 deaths in custody. However, there were more than 2,300 serious prisoner-on-prisoner assaults in the year to March. That's up 29% on the previous year. A factor in rising levels of violence, according to campaigners, is cuts in the number of staff.
What we are seeing is a toxic cocktail of both prison overcrowding, far too many people in the prisons, more people than they were designed for in the first place, alongside under-resourcing and understaffing because of cuts to prison budgets over the recent years.
In a statement today, the Ministry of Justice said, "Safety in prisons is fundamental to the proper functioning of our justice system and a vital part of our reform plans. We are fully committed to addressing the significant increase in violence, self-harm and self-inflicted deaths in our prisons." Earlier this month, an extra £14 million was announced to pay for 400 extra prison officers. Campaigners argue that simply isn't enough to make prisons safe.
Well, there's little comment today from the prison service about this incident, which, as we say, has left one man dead, 2 critically injured. There are 2 men who've been arrested on suspicion of murder. They're currently in custody and they're aged 34 and 26. What is clear, the impression I seem to be getting from people who work within the prison system, is that there are few who are surprised that something like this could have happened. Sophie.
Sarah Campbell, thank you. The number of people out of work has risen for the first time in 6 months. The latest figures suggest 10,000 more people were unemployed in the UK between June and August. But the figures also show record levels of employment and an improvement in pay rises. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity reports.
The UK economy's job creation machine has for years driven up the number of people with jobs to new records, and it's been driving unemployment down for at least 6 months to a 20-year low. The latest unemployment estimates suggest that may be slowing down.
You might think this rise in unemployment is significant, especially because it's the first time the figures have covered a period which is mostly after the referendum. But it's a rise of 10,000. That's not huge. It's within the margin of error. It could be wrong. And it's nothing like the official predictions of a rise in unemployment that were made before the referendum.
Predictions by Her Majesty's Treasury, endorsed by distinguished economists as reasonable, said after a vote to leave there'd be an immediate shock to the economy, pushing unemployment up by 500,000 over 2 years. Or worse, a severe shock that would push it up by 800,000. And the economy would fall into recession with 4 quarters of negative economic growth. Those predictions now look way out, though some firms are struggling. The builders merchant Travis Perkins, owner of the Wix do-it-yourself chain, announced today it's shutting 30 branches with 600 staff affected. Employment Minister Damien Hines visited another firm today, one which is expanding.
We've got 750,000 vacancies in this country at the moment at any one time. Employment has held steady at the high of 74.5%. That means more people in work than we have had in the past. And British business is doing well.
Independent economists aren't quite so confident. Brexit uncertainty may not have harmed jobs so far, but it still could.
It's more what happens longer term. Employment intentions are actually looking quite negative at the moment, and until we really know what Brexit's going to look like, you might well see a lot of these plans put on hold.
For now, though, pay is picking up, with an average rise of 2.3% in the year to August, or £11 a week. That's modest by historic standards, but comfortably more than inflation. Andy Verity, BBC News.
The Prime Minister has rejected suggestions of a government cover-up over complaints about the former chair of the troubled inquiry into child sexual abuse. Dame Lol Goddard stepped down this summer amid allegations she acted inappropriately, but concerns about her conduct were made months beforehand. Let's speak to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's at Westminster for us. And this is the first time that the Prime Minister has spoken publicly about this.
It is, and significant, Sophie, because you sense Theresa May is slowly but surely being sucked into the controversy surrounding the seeming chaos at the child abuse inquiry under its former chairman, the New Zealander Justice Lol Goddard. This after stories have emerged about her management style, allegations of racist comments made by her, and yesterday fellow members of her inquiry team describing how difficult she was to work with, revealing that actually they had to introduce a facilitator, a mediator to communicate with her. Today, Theresa May was asked when did she first know about the chaos gripping the inquiry. So far, the line from the Home Office is they knew nothing before July the 29th. Yesterday, MPs were told alarm bells were sounded in the Home Office in April. This lunchtime, Theresa May, pressed over when she knew, refused to give a direct answer, but revealingly said there were stories around about difficulties at the inquiry, but she chose not to intervene on the basis of hearsay and rumour. That will inevitably fuel suspicions that Theresa May was aware of the chaos engulfing the inquiry, and that will in turn fuel demands among some MPs for Theresa May, the Prime Minister, to be hauled before the Home Affairs Select Committee to answer questions about her role in the mismanagement of the child abuse inquiry.
Norman Smith in Westminster, thank you. The time is 1:15. Our top story this lunchtime. The battle to free the Iraqi city of Mosul from so-called Islamic State intensifies as thousands of civilians try to flee the fighting. And still to come, why the Olympic gymnast Lewis Smith decided to miss the Rio celebrations in London and visit a mosque.
In South today, a former hostage returns to Wiltshire. Terry Waite back at RAF Lyneham 25 years after his release from Beirut. An English rural life celebrated in the centre of Reading with a £3 million renovation.
In the next hour, the European Space Agency is hoping to make history by launching and hopefully landing a small robot on the surface of Mars. If the operation is successful, it will be the first European spacecraft to survive a landing on the planet after a failed attempt by Beagle 2 13 years ago. Scientists hope it will help them to finally prove whether there is life on Mars. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh is at Mission Control for us in Germany. Palab.
Sophie, scientists and engineers here at Mission Control are bursting with excitement as their spacecraft is approaching Mars. Many of them have waited more than a decade for this moment to see a spacecraft from Europe land on the Martian surface.
For centuries, people have looked up and wondered if there's life on other worlds. Later today, a European spacecraft will enter the Martian atmosphere. The mission's main purpose is to test out a new landing system.
It's difficult to land on Mars. You have to use heat tiles which stop the thing burning up at the top of the atmosphere, then parachutes to stop it as it goes down through the atmosphere. So doing all that with a European lander, hopefully successfully for the first time, will show, sort of that we can do it.
If it all works, the landing system will be used in a second mission in 4 years' time. Here's the prototype. A rover, designed to drive around and search for life on the rocky terrain.
NASA has sent several rovers onto the Martian surface, but this will be Europe's first. And it's different from all the other missions. This one stands the best chance of all of finding life on Mars.
The European rover will be the first to be able to drill deep under the surface. Scientists think that if there is life on Mars, it's underground.
Everything that we've learned in the last few years about Mars has actually built the body of evidence that life could still exist on Mars. So where previously our focus was maybe on past life and maybe traces, fossils or something like that of past life, now we're looking more towards current life and things that could still be existing there today.
Scientists used to think that Mars was always a dry, dusty planet, but this NASA simulation shows what they now believe, that billions of years ago the red planet was not always red, but lush and flowing with water, and so capable of supporting life long ago. But these pictures from 2011 shows that water still flows on Mars. You can see channels where it has trickled down. And where there's water, there's usually life, possibly there now, waiting to be found. It was 13 years ago that Europe last sent a lander to Mars. It was Britain's Beagle 2 probe. It descended safely to the surface, but it wasn't able to send back a signal, and so the mission failed. But this time, the European Space Agency hopes there'll be a successful landing on this mysterious and fascinating world.
There's now less than 3 hours to go before the landing, and there are so many things that could go wrong. Everyone here hopes that they all go right, and the spacecraft sends back a signal after it safely lands in just a few hours' time. Sophie.
Alab, thank you. A senior member of the European Parliament has accused British government ministers of not being properly prepared to negotiate an exit from the EU, saying they lacked a detailed knowledge of how Brussels worked. Tomorrow, Theresa May travels to Brussels for her first European Council summit as Prime Minister. Today, she said Brexit was clearly a vote to regain control over immigration. Christian Fraser reports.
The last EU summit was off limits to the British Prime Minister, but this time an invitation is extended. And tomorrow, Theresa May will sit with 27 other leaders to discuss Brexit for the first time since the vote. Both sides will listen closely for any sign of flexibility, though so far there doesn't appear to be much softening on either side.
In my opinion, the only real alternative to a hard Brexit is no Brexit.
On the fringes of the Bratislava summit in September, Boris Johnson met with foreign ministers and European MEPs. One of them was the German Elmar Brok, who sits on the influential Foreign Policy Committee in the European Parliament. He told me he was astounded by what he'd heard.
I have no clear idea of that plan because they have no idea of their plan.
You don't think they have an idea of what they want to do?
I do have not the impression that they know what they want to go, and I have also the feeling that they do not know certain conditions, which you have to know in order to make a realistic plan.
Mr Brok said he'd had to explain to Boris Johnson the UK could not have unfettered access to the single market without paying in to the EU budget.
If they believe, for example, they can go and pay a part of the internal market without financing structural funds, then I say that is the minimum of conditions are not fulfilled.
So they thought they could have access without spending the money?
Yeah.
And you said?
No.
In response, the Foreign Office statement said they would not be giving a running commentary on the progress of the talks. Others put it a little firmer.
Elmar Brok is clueless. He's a know-nothing blowhard, to put it at its mildest. How much does China pay into the single market? How much does the United States pay into the single market? How much does Taiwan pay into the single market? Zero in each case. We don't pay in to trade with foreign countries, by and large. The only foreign countries we pay to trade with are the European Union, but we buy much more from them than they buy from us.
Maybe, but many in the European Parliament share Mr Brok's views. And perhaps it poses more problems for Remainers, who presume Britain can have the same access while tweaking the rules and contributions. The message from Europe is, you can't. Christian Fraser, BBC News.
And tonight, Christian is presenting a special programme on the UK's journey out of the European Union. It's called The Brexit Effect. It's at 8 o'clock this evening on the BBC News channel. Now, the BBC has announced that Tony Blackburn will return to Radio 2 next year after he was taken off air in the wake of the Dame Janet Smith inquiry into sexual abuse at the BBC. He always insisted he was innocent of any wrongdoing and said he had been made a scapegoat. Well, our entertainment correspondent Lisa Mazimba is with me now. So what's prompted this about turn?
Well, we may never know the full details, but clearly there's been some kind of compromise. As you say, this all goes back to the Dame Janet Smith report into historic sexual abuse in Jimmy Savile at the BBC. When that report was published earlier this year, the Director General, Tony Hall, said that Tony Blackburn hadn't cooperated fully with some elements of the inquiry and he was taken off air. Tony Blackburn denied those allegations, said he'd been made a scapegoat, even threatened to sue. Now, 8 months on, the BBC has announced that he will be returning in the new year. Now, neither side appears to be backing down significantly, but what they do seem to be saying in that carefully worded language is that they've agreed to differ and move on. In his statement, Tony Blackburn said, "I do not seek to criticise the BBC for its decision." In its statement, the BBC said it stood by its decision to take him off air for a period of time. Now, of course, Tony Blackburn is an immensely long-standing figure on BBC Radio. He was the first DJ heard on Radio 1 when it launched back in 1967, a long relationship with listeners, and he's been a presence on BBC networks for 5 decades. He'll be delighted to be getting back to what he loves the most, broadcasting to his audience on the BBC. The BBC will be delighted that such a popular figure will be coming back back to the corporation, and so many listeners will be pleased that one of their favourite presenters will soon be back on the BBC airwaves.
Lisa, thank you. President Obama has told Donald Trump to stop whining after the Republican candidate repeated his claim that the US election is being rigged against him. Mr. Trump and his Democratic rival Hillary Clinton will go head-to-head in their third and final debate tonight. Last week's debate has been described as one of the nastiest ever, with both candidates attempting to discredit the other. The Olympic gymnast Lewis Smith missed yesterday's celebrations for the Rio medalists in London so that he could visit mosques and learn more about the Muslim community. It comes after footage last week in which he appeared to mock Islam. He has since apologised, describing his actions as ignorant and offensive. Atta Ahmed from the BBC's Asian network went with Lewis to the mosque.
He was the poster boy of the Olympics in 2012. Silver medalist in Rio this year.
Strictly Come Dancing champion 2012.
And winner of one of the country's most watched shows. But now Lewis Smith is facing a different challenge, getting his reputation back on track after accusations of being Islamophobic. It comes after a video was posted online showing the 27-year-old apparently mocking Islam, which led to him receiving death threats. Now the gymnast is meeting Muslims around the country.
This is the mosque itself. Shoes are fine up to here.
To try and make amends.
That meat's quite spicy.
Sitting down with them to explain why.
What you say can resonate with some people on a personal level. And what I didn't want is people to see that video and think it's okay to do what I did, or take it one step further, or 2 steps further.
While his fellow Olympians celebrated their Rio success in parades being thrown for Team GB earlier this week, Smith decided not to take part because of the controversy around the video.
I mean, I don't want to antagonise situations. I don't want people to feel like he's done what he's done and now he's out having a great time. He's out partying and socialising and stuff.
That must be hard though, seeing all the other athletes celebrating their victory and success and not being there.
It is hard, but at the same time, I'm in this position because of my own actions and my own behaviour.
Young Muslims who have met the gymnast say they're pleased he's taken time out to apologise.
I remember watching Lewis win his medal in 2012. So when this video came out, it was disappointing, and I thought, oh, maybe should I have supported him or not? But today shows again that, yeah, it was the right thing to do.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say.
Smith now plans to take up invitations to visit other mosques around the country in the coming weeks and hopes to rebuild his career and reputation as one of Britain's finest Olympians. Atta Ahmed, BBC News.
A German U-boat which sank almost a century ago has been discovered off the west coast of Scotland. It was found by engineers laying underwater power cables. It was claimed that the submarine's crew abandoned the boat because they thought they were being attacked by a monster with large eyes. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon reports.
Looming out of the darkness in the deep waters off the Stranraer coast, the German U-boat UB85. The missing sub has lain on the seabed here for almost 100 years, abandoned by its crew of German submariners. The wreck was discovered by engineers on these boats, working on a £1 billion project laying an underwater power cable between Scotland and England.
We do really detailed surveys of the seabed so we can look out for obstacles that might be in the way, and we're looking for boulders and things like that. What we didn't expect to find was a German U-boat. You know, it's probably the most amazing thing I've ever come across in the whole of my sort of construction experience.
These sonar images show the vessel sitting in waters 100 metres deep. Largely undamaged, the propellers, conning tower and deck gun are all just visible in the images. It's claimed the entire crew abandoned the U-boat as it was prowling Scottish waters after a sea monster started to attack them. The captain described the beast as having large eyes with teeth that could be seen glistening in the moonlight. Naval historians believed the truth was far more straightforward, that UB85 had been trying to avoid the British ship HMS Coreopsis, but when the U-boat started to dive, a hatch had remained open and it began to flood.
No, I don't think it was a sea monster. No, I like the idea of Nessie doing a bit for the war effort, but I think in reality the real sea monster is the U-boat. here trying to sink ships. Once the submarine was underwater, it rapidly started flooding from above. So they had no option but to just blow all the compressed air they had, bring the submarine to the surface, at which point all they could do was surrender.
Too deep to salvage, the U-boat will remain where it lies. Its final resting place now known, even if the question of what caused it to sink remains surrounded by myth. Lorna Gordon, BBC News.
Time now for a look at the weather with Phil Avery and a rather beautiful Weather Watchers photograph.
Indeed it is. Sophie, you've done this sort of work before. Very good afternoon to you. This was the scene earlier on from Oswestry. And we've seen a number of rainbows of late because we've had a supply of showers, but at times it's been just downright glorious. The dog with no brain's got enough brain to present us that particular picture. And there are islands of cloud. It's not all uninterrupted sunshine by any means at all. You'll notice just out towards the east, we've got something a little bit more meaningful than the odd shower. It's just offshore at the moment, but ahead of that, there are some hefty showers to be had. And notice the number of isobars just packing in there across eastern parts as well. And there is the risk for the rest of the afternoon on into the evening, one of that pretty strong wind, gusts around about 30 miles an hour or so at the moment, and there's just the chance that you might get the odd rumble of thunder, but that'll be few and far between. As you come that little bit further towards the west, not particularly warm, it has to be said, despite the increasing amounts of sunshine there and the risk of the odd lighter shower. But there's a lot of dry weather around, and that'll be the path of it, not only for the rest of the afternoon, but on into the evening and indeed overnight. Still keeping that wind going, still noticing that we've got the bulk of the showers towards the east. Not a particularly cold night, although up across the western side of Scotland, underneath the high pressure, the sky's clear. You may just drop away close to 0 or so. And then Thursday, any marked changes? Well, not really. The bulk of the wind is still across those eastern areas, the heaviest of the showers out east. Perhaps they'll just come a little bit further inland, but the bigger picture shows that many areas will again stay dry, although I think you'll just lose your sunshine, perhaps across the Western Isles to finish off today, because as I take you into Friday, we have got a weather front there just impinging on the western flank of the high pressure. So that may just give a wee bit of rain across the very far northwest of Scotland, maybe flirting with parts of Western Northern Ireland too. But again, there's a lot of dry weather, still that sprinkling of showers and that rather gusty wind across the eastern parts of East Anglia. So we've got to the promised land of the weekend. The high pressure is still there, nosing down from Scandinavia, but it's having a bit of a battle with a developing area of low pressure away towards Biscay. Notice the number of isobars. That wind will be an increasing feature of the weekend. Not a particularly warm weekend. There will be some sunshine in there. I think the showers tending to move from east into central parts at times through the course of the weekend, but it is not all doom and gloom by any means at all. A mixture of sunshine and showers on into the weekend. A little bit of patchy frost and fog where the high pressure really kicks in. And then, yes, I suspect you're going to have to wait a little bit later on in the schedule on BBC One to see anything like a suggestion of baking. BBC One tonight at 8 o'clock.
Oh, Phil, thank you. A reminder of our main story this lunchtime. The battle to free the Iraqi city of Mosul from so-called Islamic State intensifies as thousands of civilians try to flee the fighting. That's all from the BBC News at 1. It's goodbye from me on BBC One. We now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.